The poker chips clattered across the worn table as Annie Gallagher watched her brother Thomas bet away their last $100 on a hand he could not possibly win. And in that moment, she knew their lives were about to change forever. The saloon in St. Joseph, Missouri, reeked of whiskey and desperation on that sweltering August evening in 1875. Annie had begged Thomas not to come here, not to sit down at that table with Marcus Flynn, the most ruthless card player and loan shark in 3 counties. But Thomas, 22 years old and convinced his luck would turn, had already borrowed $500 from Flynn 2 months prior, and tonight he had promised to pay it back with interest. Instead, he was losing more. Annie stood near the bar, her worn calico dress damp with perspiration, her dark auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun. At 20 years old, she had already lost both parents to cholera 3 years ago, and since then, she had been trying to keep Thomas on the straight path. She worked as a seamstress, her fingers raw from endless stitching, barely making enough to keep food on their table and a roof over their heads in the small room they rented above the general store. "I am out," Thomas said, his voice cracking as he threw down his cards. The color had drained from his face, leaving him pale as milk. Marcus Flynn leaned back in his chair, a predatory smile spreading across his weathered features. He was perhaps 40, with cold gray eyes and a reputation for collecting debts one way or another. "That makes $800 you owe me now, Gallagher, plus interest. Call it 1,000 even." "I do not have it," Thomas whispered. "You know I do not have it. Then we have a problem." Flynn's gaze shifted across the room and landed on Annie. His smile widened. "Unless you have something else of value." Annie's blood turned to ice. She saw exactly where this was heading, and her hands gripped the edge of the bar behind her. Thomas followed Flynn's gaze, and horror flooded his features. "No, absolutely not. Your sister would fetch a good price. I know a couple of establishments in Kansas City that would pay handsomely for a pretty thing like her. Fresh, young, still has that innocent look about her." Flynn drummed his fingers on the table. "That would cover your debt, and then some." "You are insane," Thomas said, standing up so quickly his chair toppled backward. "I would never." "Sit down, boy." Flynn's hand moved to rest on the revolver at his hip. The saloon had gone quiet, all eyes on their table. "You sit down and we talk about this civilized-like, or I put a bullet in you right here and take her anyway. Your choice." Annie's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but her legs would not move. She had heard stories about women who disappeared into the brothels of the bigger cities, never to be heard from again. That could not be her fate. It simply could not. The saloon doors swung open and a man walked in, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Annie barely glanced at him, too focused on the nightmare unfolding before her, but something about the sudden change in the room's atmosphere made her look up. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that brushed his collar. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy: dusty denim pants, a faded blue shirt, a leather vest, and a wide-brimmed hat that he removed as he entered, revealing a strong-featured face with intelligent hazel eyes. He could not have been older than 26 or 27. There was something about the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that suggested he was not a man to be trifled with, despite his youth. He surveyed the room, taking in the scene, and his gaze lingered on Annie for just a moment before moving to the poker table where Thomas stood frozen, and Flynn sat with his hand still resting on his weapon. The stranger walked to the bar, standing just a few feet from Annie. "Whiskey," he said to the bartender, his voice deep and measured. "And whatever is happening over there, I would appreciate the details." The bartender, a grizzled man named Pete who had seen everything in his 30 years running this establishment, poured the whiskey and leaned in. Marcus Flynn is calling in a debt. The boy cannot pay, so Flynn wants to take his sister instead. Sell her off to cover what is owed. The stranger's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, then set the glass down with deliberate care. How much is the debt? $1,000. The stranger was silent for a moment, then reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a thick leather wallet. Annie watched, hardly daring to breathe, as he counted out bills onto the bar. Here is $2,000. Tell Flynn the debt is paid in full, with extra for his trouble, and the girl stays free. Pete's eyebrows shot up. Mister, you do not know what you are doing. Flynn does not like interference in his business. I know exactly what I am doing. The stranger picked up the money and walked toward Flynn's table, and Annie found herself following, drawn by something she could not name. Flynn looked up as the stranger approached, his expression wary. This does not concern you, friend. I am making it my concern. The stranger placed the $2,000 on the table. The Gallagher debt is paid. $2,000. That is double what is owed. Take it and walk away. Flynn stared at the money, then at the stranger. And what do you want in return? The girl for yourself? I want nothing in return. The debt is settled. That is all. The silence in the saloon was absolute. Annie could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. This made no sense. Strangers did not simply pay off other people's debts, especially not debts this large, and certainly not without expecting something in return. Flynn slowly picked up the bills, counting them one by one. Annie could see the calculations running behind his eyes. $2,000 was more money than he would get from selling her, even to the highest-paying establishment. It was cash in hand, no risk, no trouble. But his pride was clearly stinging at being outmaneuvered. Who are you? Flynn finally asked. My name is Henry Keller. I run cattle between here and Colorado. That is all you need to know. Flynn studied Henry for a long moment, then shrugged and pocketed the money. The debt is paid, then. Gallagher, you are free and clear. But if you ever sit at my table again, I will not be so accommodating. He stood, tipped his hat to Annie with a mocking smile, and walked out of the saloon, his boots echoing in the silence. The moment he was gone, the saloon erupted into conversation, but Annie could only stare at Henry Keller, this stranger who had just saved her from a fate worse than death. Thomas stumbled forward, his face a mixture of relief and shame. Sir, I do not know how to thank you. I swear I will pay you back every cent. I will work. I will do whatever it takes. Henry held up a hand. I do not want your money. I do not want anything from you, but you need to stop gambling before you destroy what is left of your life and your sister's. Thomas hung his head. You are right. I know you are right. I have a problem. I thought I could win it all back. They always do, Henry said quietly. He turned to Annie, and for the first time she met his eyes fully. They were kind, she realized. Tired, perhaps, but kind. Miss Gallagher, I apologize for the intrusion. I hope you are all right. Annie found her voice, though it came out shakier than she would have liked. You just paid $2,000 for nothing. Why? Henry was quiet for a moment, as if considering how to answer. Because it was the right thing to do. Because no woman should be traded like property to settle a debt that was not hers to begin with. He settled his hat back on his head. I will take my leave now. I wish you both well. He turned to go, and Annie felt a sudden, desperate need to stop him, to understand this man who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not even known how to pray. Wait, please. Henry paused, looking back at her. At least let me thank you properly. Let me make you dinner. Tomorrow night. It is the least I can do. The words tumbled out before she could think better of them. Henry studied her for a moment, and she thought he would refuse. Then slowly he nodded. "That would be kind of you, Miss Gallagher. Tomorrow evening, then." "Annie," she said. "My name is Annie." A small smile touched his lips, the first she had seen from him. "Annie, you can call me Henry." He glanced at Thomas. "Keep your sister safe, Gallagher, and stay away from the card tables." Then he was gone, disappearing through the saloon doors into the hot August night. Annie turned to Thomas, who looked like he might be sick. "I am so sorry," he whispered. "Annie, I am so sorry. I never meant for it to go that far. You thought wrong," Annie said, and she was surprised by the steadiness in her voice despite the trembling in her hands. "Thomas, you have to stop. This cannot happen again. We nearly lost everything tonight. I nearly lost my freedom, my life." I know." Thomas ran his hands through his hair, his eyes red-rimmed. "I will stop. I swear on our parents' graves, I will never touch another card, never place another bet." Annie wanted to believe him. She desperately wanted to believe him. But she had heard promises before, and they had always crumbled like dust. That night, in their small room above the general store, Annie lay awake on her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while Thomas snored softly across the room. She kept seeing Henry Keller's face, the calm way he had handled the situation, the surety with which he had placed that money on the table. $2,000. It was more money than she would earn in 5 years of sewing. Why had he done it? Men did not simply give away fortunes without expecting something in return. Yet he had asked for nothing. He had even seemed uncomfortable when she offered him dinner, as though he would have preferred to simply disappear back into whatever life he had come from. But he had accepted. He would come tomorrow evening, and Annie would have a chance to understand this mysterious cowboy who had saved her life. The next day passed in a blur of nervous energy. Annie used a portion of her carefully hoarded savings to buy a chicken, fresh vegetables, flour for biscuits, and even a small jar of honey. Mrs. Patterson at the general store raised her eyebrows at the purchases, but said nothing, though her curiosity was evident. Annie cleaned their small room until every surface gleamed, swept the floor twice, and arranged the few wildflowers she had gathered from the empty lot behind the store in a chipped ceramic vase. It was not much. Their living space consisted of a single room with 2 beds, a small table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, and a few hooks on the wall for their limited clothing, but it was clean and it was theirs. Thomas had left early that morning to look for work at the rail yard, true to his word about changing his ways. Annie hoped it would last. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Annie changed into her best dress, a simple green cotton that she had made herself, with careful stitching at the collar and cuffs. She brushed out her auburn hair and pinned it up properly, allowing a few tendrils to frame her face. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked the chicken roasting in the oven and stirred the vegetables simmering on the stove. A knock at the door made her jump. She smoothed her dress, took a deep breath, and opened it. Henry Keller stood in the hallway, his hat in his hands, looking considerably cleaner than he had the night before. He had bathed and shaved, wearing what were clearly his best clothes: pressed denim pants, a white shirt, and a dark vest. His damp hair was combed back, and Annie caught the faint scent of soap. "Miss Annie," he said with a slight nod, "I hope I am not too early." "Not at all. Please come in." Annie stepped aside, suddenly acutely aware of how small and shabby their room must seem to him. Henry entered, ducking his head slightly to clear the doorframe. He looked around the room, and Annie braced herself for judgment or pity, but when his eyes met hers again, she saw only respect. "You have made a good home here. It is not much, but it serves us well enough." Annie moved to the stove, grateful for something to do with her hands. "Please sit. Dinner is almost ready." Henry sat at the small table, placing his hat on the floor beside his chair. Annie served the meal, her nervousness making her movements slightly clumsy, but Henry did not seem to notice or mind. When they were both seated with full plates before them, an awkward silence fell. "This looks delicious," Henry said finally. "Thank you for going to such trouble." "It is the least I can do after what you did for us." Annie cut a piece of chicken, then set down her fork without eating it. "Henry, I need to understand. Why did you pay Thomas's debt? And please do not tell me it was simply the right thing to do." "People do not give away $2,000 just because it is right." Henry was quiet for a moment, chewing thoughtfully. When he spoke, his voice was low and measured. 5 years ago, my younger sister Lily got herself into trouble with a man in Denver. He was a gambler, a smooth talker, and she was 17 and naive. He convinced her to run away with him, promised her the world. By the time I tracked them down, he had sold her to a brothel to cover his own debts. Annie's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, Henry, I got her out. Paid what I had to pay, threatened what I had to threaten, but she was never the same after that. The things they did to her in those weeks." He paused, his jaw working. "She took her own life 6 months later, could not live with what had been done to her." "I am so sorry," Annie whispered. "I swore that day that if I ever had the chance to prevent another woman from suffering the same fate, I would take it, no matter the cost. Money can be earned back. A life destroyed cannot be undone." Henry met her eyes. "So when I walked into that saloon and saw Flynn looking at you the way he was, I knew what I had to do." Annie felt tears prickling at her eyes. "You paid double." "Why double?" A ghost of a smile crossed Henry's face. "Because men like Flynn respect money above all else." Paying exactly what was owed might have left him looking for ways to cause trouble later, trying to save face. Paying double made it clear that I had resources, that I was not to be trifled with, and that it was better business to take the money and move on. "You are a smart man, Henry Keller." "I have had to be. The world does not give you much choice in that regard." They ate in more comfortable silence for a while, and Annie found herself stealing glances at Henry when she thought he was not looking. There was something solid about him, something trustworthy. He had been devastated by tragedy, yet instead of becoming bitter, he had turned his pain into protection for others. It was remarkable. "Tell me about your cattle business," Annie said, wanting to know more about him. "I started 5 years ago with a small herd I bought with money I had saved working as a ranch hand. I drive cattle from Texas up through Missouri and into Colorado, selling to various ranches and towns along the way. It is hard work, long days in the saddle, sleeping under the stars more often than in a bed, but it is honest and it has been good to me. I have built up a reputation for fair dealing and quality stock." "Is it lonely?" The question slipped out before Annie could stop it. Henry considered this. "Sometimes. I have a few reliable men who work with me on the drives, good fellows who I trust. But yes, there are long stretches where it is just me and the cattle and the prairie. I have gotten used to my own company." "You have family besides." Annie trailed off, not wanting to bring up painful memories. "My parents are both passed. My father from a horse accident when I was 16, my mother from pneumonia 2 years after that. Lily was all I had left." Henry paused. "And now it is just me." "I am sorry," Annie said softly. "Thomas and I lost our parents to cholera. It was sudden, terrible. 1 week they were healthy, the next they were gone. Thomas took it especially hard. I think that is part of why he started gambling, trying to escape the pain of it. Grief can drive people to do foolish things," Henry agreed. "But at some point, we have to choose to keep living, to honor those we lost by making something of the life we still have." They talked long into the evening, the conversation flowing more easily as time went on. Annie learned that Henry was 27 years old, that he loved the open range but sometimes wondered what it would be like to have a permanent home, that he could play the harmonica and had a terrible singing voice, that his favorite food was apple pie, and that he had once broken his arm falling out of a tree trying to rescue a cat. In turn, Annie told him about her seamstress work, about the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with her own hands, about how she dreamed of one day having her own dress shop, about the garden she had tried and failed to grow behind the store, and about how she loved thunderstorms and the smell of rain on dusty earth. When Thomas finally returned home well after dark, exhausted from a day of loading freight cars at the rail yard, he found Annie and Henry still talking, their empty plates long since cleared away. Thomas looked surprised but pleased to see Henry there. "Sir, I am glad you came," Thomas said, his voice sincere. "I wanted to thank you again properly. What you did is already done and does not need to be revisited," Henry said, standing. "I am glad to see you spent the day doing honest work." Thomas nodded. "I got hired on for regular shifts. The pay is not much, but it is steady, and the foreman said if I work hard, there is room to move up. I meant what I said last night. I am done with gambling." "Good. Your sister needs you to be the man you are capable of being." Henry picked up his hat, then turned to Annie. "Thank you for the wonderful dinner and the even better company. I cannot remember the last time I enjoyed an evening so much." Annie stood, suddenly reluctant to see him go. "Will you be staying in St. Joseph for a while? I have business here for the next week or so. I am negotiating to buy some breeding stock from a rancher outside of town, and these things take time. Then perhaps you would like to join us for dinner again. Tomorrow night." Annie felt her cheeks warm. "I mean, if you would like to. I understand if you are too busy." Henry's expression softened. "I would like that very much, Annie. Same time tomorrow." "Yes, tomorrow." After Henry left, Thomas looked at Annie with a knowing smile. "You like him?" "I barely know him," Annie protested, but she could feel herself blushing. "You barely know him, but you like him," Thomas said. "And I do not blame you. He is a good man. A man who does what he did, expecting nothing in return, that is the kind of man worth knowing." Annie could not argue with that. The next evening, Henry returned, and the evening after that, and the one after that. What began as Annie's attempt to repay a debt transformed into something neither of them had expected. Henry would arrive each evening after his business concluded for the day, and they would share a simple meal and talk for hours. Sometimes Thomas joined them, but often he made himself scarce, working late shifts or visiting friends, giving Annie and Henry time alone. On the fourth evening, Henry brought Annie a gift, a beautiful length of deep blue fabric he had purchased from a traveling merchant. "I know you so," he said, almost shyly. "I thought you might like this." Annie ran her hands over the material, which was finer than anything she had ever worked with. "Henry, this is too much. This must have cost. It cost what it cost, and I wanted you to have it. Perhaps you could make yourself a new dress. I would like to see you in blue. I think it would match your eyes." Annie's eyes were actually more gray than blue, but she did not correct him. Her heart was too full to speak for a moment. "Thank you. This is the kindest gift anyone has ever given me." That night after dinner, they sat together on the steps outside the general store, watching the sun set over St. Joseph. The August heat had finally begun to break, and there was a pleasant coolness in the evening air. "My business here is nearly concluded," Henry said quietly. "I will be heading out in 2 days to drive the new stock back to my ranch in Colorado." Annie's heart sank, though she tried not to show it. "I see. Well, I am glad you were able to complete your negotiations successfully." "Annie." Henry turned to look at her, and in the fading light his face was serious. "These past few days have been some of the best I have known, Your company has been. It has been a gift I did not expect and do not deserve. Why would you say you do not deserve it? Because I am a wanderer with no permanent home. Because my life is on the trail more often than not. Because I have nothing to offer a woman like you, nothing stable or secure. A woman like me, Annie repeated. Henry, a week ago, I was nearly sold to a brothel. I live in a single room with my brother. I own 3 dresses, including the one I am wearing. I am not some fine lady who needs luxury and security. You deserve those things, though. You deserve better than what you have. What I deserve, Annie said firmly, is to be treated with respect and kindness, to be seen as a person rather than property, to have my choices honored and my voice heard. You have given me all of those things in the short time I have known you. That is worth more than all the security in the world. Henry was quiet for a long moment. I cannot stop thinking about you, he finally said, his voice rough. I know it is foolish, I know it is impossible, but from the moment I saw you in that saloon, something in my chest just shifted. And every evening I have spent with you has only made it worse. Worse, Annie whispered. Worse because I have to leave. Worse because I want things I have no right to want. Worse because I am falling in love with you and I do not know what to do about it. Annie's breath caught. The world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them, sitting on those old wooden steps as the stars began to appear overhead. What if I said I was falling in love with you too? Henry closed his eyes. Then it would make leaving even harder. Then do not leave. Or rather, let me come with you. His eyes snapped open. Annie, you cannot be serious. Why not? What is here for me? A room above a store. Endless sewing to barely scrape by. A brother who is trying to change but may fall back into old habits at any moment. Henry, you have shown me in just a few days that there is more to life than mere survival. When I am with you, I feel alive in a way I have not felt since my parents died. The trail is hard. It is dangerous. There are storms and stampedes and crossing rivers and long days with nothing but prairie in every direction. It is not a life for a woman, Annie challenged. Women have been making their way west for years now. I am strong, Henry. I'm not afraid of hard work. And I would rather face those challenges with you than spend another year slowly dying of loneliness here. Henry stood abruptly, pacing a few steps away, his hands clenched at his sides. Annie watched him struggle with himself, saw the war playing out across his features. When he turned back to her, his expression was anguished. If I take you with me, people will talk. Your reputation, my reputation, was nearly destroyed a week ago, Annie pointed out. I am sure the whole town knows what almost happened at that saloon. And frankly, I do not care what people think, but if you are concerned about propriety. She took a deep breath, hardly believing she was about to say this. Then marry me. Henry stared at her. You are proposing to me, I suppose I am. Annie stood, walking over to him. Henry Keller, I know we have only known each other for a few days. I know this is rash and impulsive and probably foolish. But I also know that I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. I know that you are good and kind and honorable. I know that when I imagine my future, the only version that does not fill me with dread is the one where you are in it. So yes, I am proposing to you. Marry me and let me come with you to Colorado. Annie. Henry reached out, cupping her face gently in his calloused hands. You barely know me. Then we will spend the rest of our lives getting to know each other better. Is that not what marriage is supposed to be? A laugh escaped him, soft and wondering. You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever met. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. Are you absolutely certain about this? Because once we start down this path, I will not let you go easily. If you marry me, Annie Gallagher, you are mine for life. I do not give up on things that matter to me. I am certain, Annie said, and she was. It was insane, it was impulsive, but it was also the surest she had felt about anything since her parents had died. I am absolutely certain. Henry leaned down slowly, giving her time to change her mind to pull away. Annie did not move. When his lips met hers, soft and careful, the kiss felt like a promise, like coming home to a place she had never been but had always been searching for. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Henry rested his forehead against hers. "We will do this properly. Tomorrow we will go to the church and speak with the minister. We will have a real wedding, even if it is small. I will not have anyone say I did not treat you with the respect you deserve." "Tomorrow," Annie agreed. And then we start our life together. I will teach you to ride, to handle cattle, to shoot if you do not already know how. We will travel to Colorado together, and I will show you the ranch I have been building. It is not much yet, just a cabin and some outbuildings, but it is on good land with water and grass. We will make it into a real home together." "That sounds perfect," Annie whispered. They told Thomas that night. He was shocked at first, then concerned, then finally accepting when he saw how Annie looked at Henry and how Henry looked at Annie. "Take care of her," he said to Henry, his voice thick. "She is all the family I have left." "I will protect her with my life," Henry promised. "And Thomas, you have a place with us too if you want it, in Colorado. There is work to be done on a ranch, honest work with good pay. A chance to start fresh, away from the temptations here." Thomas was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I would like that. A fresh start. That is exactly what I need." He turned to Annie. "Are you sure about this? It is all happening so fast." "I am sure," Annie said. "I have never been more sure of anything." The next morning they went to the small church at the edge of town. Reverend Matthews, a kindly man in his 50s who had presided over Annie's parents' funeral, listened to their story with raised eyebrows but without judgment. "This is quite sudden," he observed. "Yes, sir," Henry agreed. "But we are both adults, both of sound mind and both certain of our feelings. We would be honored if you would perform the ceremony." Reverend Matthews studied them both for a long moment, then smiled. "I have been a minister for 27 years. I have married couples who courted for years and were separated within months, and I have married couples who barely knew each other who went on to have long, happy marriages. What matters is not the length of the courtship, but the strength of the commitment. If you are both willing to make that commitment before God and witnesses, then I will gladly perform the ceremony." They were married that afternoon in the small church, with Thomas and Reverend Matthew's wife serving as witnesses. Annie wore the green dress she had worn on their first dinner together, and she carried a simple bouquet of wildflowers. Henry stood tall and serious in his best clothes, his eyes never leaving her face as she walked down the short aisle toward him. The ceremony was brief but beautiful. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Henry kissed Annie gently, his hand cradling the back of her head, and she felt tears of joy slip down her cheeks. This was real. This was happening. She was Annie Keller now, married to this good man who had saved her life and then stolen her heart. That evening, they moved Annie's few belongings to the room Henry had been renting at the boarding house. It was slightly larger than what she had shared with Thomas, with a real bed instead of a narrow cot and a window that overlooked the main street. Thomas would keep the room above the general store until they left for Colorado in a few days. Their wedding night was tender and a little awkward, as first times often are, but Henry was patient and gentle, and Annie felt safe in his arms in a way she had never felt with anyone else. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Henry's fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "I am the luckiest man alive," he murmured into her hair. "I am fairly lucky myself," Annie replied, pressing a kiss to his chest. "Annie, I promise you, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this decision. I will work hard, I will provide for you, I will be faithful to you, and I will love you until the day I die." Annie tilted her head up to look at him. "I know you will. And I promise the same to you. We are in this together now, Henry, for better or worse, in good times and bad, just like we vowed today." "Together," Henry agreed and kissed her again. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of activity. Henry completed his business dealings, purchasing 10 head of fine breeding cattle from the rancher he had been negotiating with. Annie sold her sewing supplies and fabrics to Mrs. Patterson, keeping only her needles, thread, and the beautiful blue material Henry had given her. Thomas gave notice at the rail yard and packed up his own meager belongings. On the morning they were set to leave, Annie stood in front of the general store one last time, looking up at the small window that had been her home for 3 years. She felt a pang of something not quite sadness, not quite nostalgia. It had been a hard life here, a lonely life in many ways, but it had also been where she had learned to survive on her own, where she had grown from a frightened 17-year-old orphan into a woman who knew her own mind and her own worth. "Ready?" Henry asked softly, coming to stand beside her. He had purchased a sturdy wagon and team of horses for the journey, knowing that Annie was not yet an experienced enough rider to make the trip on horseback. "Ready," Annie confirmed, taking one last look before turning away. "Let us go home." The journey to Colorado took 3 weeks. They traveled slowly because of the cattle, moving at a pace the animals could sustain. Henry rode alongside the herd most days, with Thomas learning the work and proving himself to be a quick study and hard worker. Annie drove the wagon, and in the evenings, Henry taught her to handle a rifle and a revolver, insisting that she know how to protect herself in the wild country they were entering. They passed through the Kansas prairie, endless miles of waving grass under vast blue skies. They forded rivers, which Annie found both terrifying and exhilarating. They weathered a fierce thunderstorm that had Annie gripping the wagon seat white-knuckled while Henry and Thomas struggled to keep the cattle from stampeding. They saw vast herds of buffalo in the distance, more animals than Annie had ever imagined could exist in one place. At night, they made camp under the stars. Annie learned to cook over an open fire, to make coffee strong enough to satisfy the men, to bake biscuits in a Dutch oven buried in hot coals. Henry would often sit beside her after supper, teaching her the constellations, telling her stories of his previous drives, making her laugh with tales of mishaps and adventures. Thomas seemed to transform during the journey. Away from the temptations of town, doing honest physical work that left him exhausted but satisfied at the end of each day, he began to look healthier, happier. The haunted look that had shadowed his eyes for so long gradually faded. Annie watched this transformation with relief and gratitude. One evening, about 2 weeks into the journey, they camped beside a creek, the water running clear and cold from mountain springs. After dinner, Henry took Annie's hand and led her away from the camp, walking upstream to where a bend in the creek created a private pool. "I thought you might like to wash properly," he said. "The water is cold, but it is clean and private here." Annie could have kissed him just for the thoughtfulness. The trail was dusty and hot, and she felt like she had accumulated weeks of grime despite it only being days since they left St. Joseph. "That sounds wonderful, but what about you and Thomas? We will take our turn after. Go on, take your time." Annie bathed in the cold creek water, washing her hair and scrubbing away the dust with the bar of soap she had packed. When she emerged, clean and shivering slightly in the cooling evening air, she found Henry had left her a blanket to dry off with. She dressed in clean clothes from the trunk in the wagon, feeling more human than she had in days. When she returned to camp, Thomas was already asleep in his bedroll, exhausted from the day's work. Henry was sitting by the fire, cleaning his rifle. He looked up as Annie approached, and his eyes warmed at the sight of her. "Feel better, much better, thank you." Annie sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Your turn. The water is cold but glorious. In a moment." Henry set aside his rifle and turned to face her. "Annie, are you happy? Truly. This is not the life I imagine most women dream of, living out of a wagon, driving cattle, sleeping on the ground more often than in a bed. Most women do not dream of nearly being sold to a brothel either," Annie pointed out. "Henry, I am happier than I have been in years, maybe ever. Yes, it is hard, and yes, I am tired and sore and dustier than I have ever been in my life. But I am also free. I am with you. I am seeing parts of the country I never imagined I would see. How could I not be happy?" Henry cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing across her cheek. "You are an extraordinary woman, Annie Keller. And you are an extraordinary man, Henry Keller." She leaned in and kissed him, soft and sweet, tasting of coffee and the wild openness of the prairie. They reached the Colorado Territory in the third week of September, just as the aspens on the mountainsides were beginning to turn gold. Henry's ranch was nestled in a valley with a clear stream running through it, surrounded by rolling hills that would provide good grazing. The cabin was small but solidly built, with a stone fireplace, 2 rooms, and a covered porch. There were corrals for the horses and cattle, a barn for hay and equipment, and a smaller bunkhouse where Thomas would stay. Annie stood in front of the cabin, taking it all in. It was rustic and remote, at least 2 hours' ride from the nearest town, but there was something deeply appealing about it. The air was clean and thin at this altitude, the sky a brilliant blue, the aspens whispering in the breeze. "What do you think?" Henry asked, and Annie heard the nervousness in his voice. She turned to him with a genuine smile. "I think it is perfect. I think it is home." The relief on his face was palpable. He swept her up in his arms, making her laugh, and carried her across the threshold of their cabin. "Welcome home, Mrs. Keller." They spent the next weeks settling in. Annie cleaned the cabin from top to bottom, making curtains for the windows from some of the fabric she had brought, arranging their few possessions to make the space feel more like a home. She started a garden plot beside the cabin, even though it was late in the season, determined to have something growing come spring. She learned to churn butter, to smoke meat, to preserve vegetables for the winter ahead. Henry and Thomas worked dawn to dusk on the ranch, repairing fences, breaking horses, preparing for winter. Thomas proved himself invaluable, his natural affinity for animals and his willingness to work hard making him an asset to the operation. Henry began paying him wages, a small salary that Thomas saved carefully, talking about someday having his own place, his own fresh start. On Sundays they rested. Henry would often take Annie riding, teaching her to handle a horse with skill and confidence. They would pack a lunch and ride out to explore their land, 200 acres that Henry had claimed and was slowly improving. Annie loved these excursions, loved the freedom of riding across open country with the man she loved, loved discovering hidden meadows and quiet groves of aspen and pine. One Sunday in late October, they rode up to a high meadow that overlooked the entire valley. The aspens were in full golden glory, so bright against the blue sky that it almost hurt to look at them. They dismounted and sat on a flat rock, eating the lunch Annie had packed: bread, cheese, cold chicken, and apples. "I have been thinking," Henry said after a while, About what? About expanding the ranch. We have good land here, good water, and I have a reputation for quality stock. If we work hard over the next few years, build up the herd, maybe get some more help, we could have something really substantial. Maybe even have a family to pass it on to someday. Annie felt her heart skip. They had been married for 2 months now, and while she had thought about children in abstract terms, they had not really discussed it concretely. A family. Henry looked at her, and there was vulnerability in his eyes. I would like that, someday, if you would. I know it is dangerous for women. I know it is painful, and I would never pressure you, but I lost my whole family, Annie. The thought of having one again with you, of having children who would grow up safe and loved and free, it means everything to me. Annie took his hand, lacing their fingers together. I would like that too, very much. Not right away, perhaps. I want us to have time together first, just the two of us, to build this ranch in our life. But yes, someday, I want to have your children, Henry. I want to fill this valley with life and laughter and love. He kissed her then, deep and passionate, there on the rock overlooking their land, with the golden aspens shimmering around them and the Colorado sky spreading endlessly overhead. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Henry rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Annie Keller, more than I knew it was possible to love another person. I love you too, Henry, so much it scares me sometimes. Do not be scared. We have each other, and that is enough to face anything this world throws at us. Winter came to the Colorado high country in early November, bringing snow that transformed the valley into a wonderland of white. The work changed with the season. There was less range work and more time spent in the barn, caring for the animals through the cold months, repairing equipment, planning for spring. Annie found she did not mind the isolation. In fact, she treasured the long evenings by the fire with Henry, the two of them reading or talking or simply sitting in comfortable silence. Thomas often joined them, and the three of them would play cards for buttons. Not Money or Thomas would play the harmonica while Annie sewed and Henry whittled. It was a peaceful life, a good life, so different from the desperate existence Annie had known in St. Joseph. She had enough to eat, a warm home, work that satisfied her, and most importantly, she had Henry. She had love. In December, on a cold, clear morning, Annie realized she had missed her monthly courses. She waited another week to be sure, then another, before finally telling Henry. They were in bed one night, wrapped warm under quilts while snow fell softly outside the window. Henry, I think I might be with child. Henry went very still. Are you certain? Not completely certain, but fairly sure. I have missed my courses, and I have been feeling queasy in the mornings, and my breasts are tender. I have heard those are signs. Henry rolled over to face her, his hand moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. In the dim light from the dying fire, his eyes shone. A baby, our baby. Are you happy about it? Annie asked, suddenly nervous. I know we said someday, and perhaps it is too soon. Too soon. Henry laughed, a sound of pure joy. Annie, this is the best news you could have given me. A baby, a child to love and raise and teach, a future. He kissed her gently. Are you happy about it? Annie thought about it, really thought about it. Was she scared? Yes. Childbirth was dangerous, and they were hours from the nearest doctor. Was she worried about the added responsibility? Yes. But underneath all of that was a bubbling excitement, a sense of rightness. I am happy, she said. I am really, truly happy. We will take good care of you, Henry promised. Both of you. Whatever you need, whatever makes you comfortable. And when the time comes, we will get the doctor from town or a midwife, someone who knows what they are doing. The pregnancy progressed through the winter and into spring. Annie suffered from morning sickness in the early months, but it passed, and by spring she felt better than she had in years. Her belly swelled with the growing baby, and she felt the first flutters of movement in April, like tiny butterflies inside her. Henry was attentive to the point of being comical sometimes, insisting she not lift anything heavy, rest whenever she was tired, eat plenty of good food. Thomas, when they told him he was going to be an uncle, was delighted and immediately began carving toys for the baby: a horse, a cow, a little wooden dog. As Annie's belly grew larger, so did the ranch. Henry hired 2 more hands for the spring cattle drive, good men who Thomas had befriended at the general store in town. The drive was successful, bringing in good money that Henry immediately invested back into the ranch: more cattle, better equipment, materials to expand the cabin. Through that summer of 1876, while Annie grew round and ripe with child, Henry and Thomas and the hired hands built an addition onto the cabin: 2 more rooms, one for the baby and one for guests or future children. They replaced the old stone fireplace with a larger one, added more windows to let in light, built a proper kitchen with a good stove and counter space. Annie nested, as Henry teasingly called it. She sewed tiny clothes from soft fabric. She knitted blankets and caps. She filled a trunk with all the things a baby would need. She made jam from the wild berries that grew along the creek. She tended her garden, which was producing bountifully now that she had had a full season to establish it. In early August, when Annie was huge and uncomfortable and ready to be done with pregnancy, Henry rode into town and brought back Mrs. Sarah Chen, a midwife who had a reputation for skill and experience. Mrs. Chen was a Chinese woman in her 40s who had come west with her husband to work on the railroad and had stayed after his death, supporting herself with her healing skills. She was practical, no nonsense, and immediately put Annie at ease. "You are young, strong, healthy, Mrs. Chen said after examining Annie. "The baby is positioned well. You will do fine, but the baby will come when the baby is ready and not a moment before." The baby decided to be ready on August 15th in the early hours of the morning. Annie woke to cramping pain and wetness between her legs, and she knew immediately what was happening. She shook Henry awake, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. "Henry, it is time." Henry was on his feet in seconds, pulling on clothes. "I will get Mrs. Chen. She is staying in the bunkhouse." "Just breathe, Annie, just breathe. You are going to be fine." The next 12 hours were the hardest of Annie's life. The pain came in waves, stronger and closer together as the day wore on. Mrs. Chen was a calm, steady presence, coaching Annie through each contraction, checking her progress, offering words of encouragement. Henry held Annie's hand, wiped her forehead with cool cloths, told her over and over how strong she was, how brave, how much he loved her. By evening, Annie was exhausted, convinced she could not go on. But Mrs. Chen said she was ready to push, and some deep instinct took over. She bore down with each contraction, crying out with the effort and pain, gripping Henry's hand so hard she was probably breaking bones. And then, as the sun was setting over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, their son was born. He came out with a lusty cry, healthy and whole, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air. Mrs. Chen cleaned him quickly and placed him on Annie's chest, and Annie looked down at this tiny person, this miracle, and felt a love so fierce and overwhelming that it took her breath away. "A boy," she whispered. "Henry, we have a son." Henry was crying, tears streaming openly down his face as he looked at his wife and child. "He is perfect. Annie, he is absolutely perfect." He kissed her forehead, then carefully, reverently, touched one finger to the baby's tiny hand. The baby immediately grabbed onto it, holding tight. "Hello, little one. I am your father, and I promise you, I will love you and protect you every day of your life." They named him James Thomas Keller, James for Henry's father and Thomas for Annie's brother. Little James was a good baby, healthy and growing fast. He had Henry's hazel eyes and Annie's auburn hair, and from the start, he had a strong personality that suggested he would be a force to be reckoned with as he grew. Thomas was a devoted uncle, spending every free moment with the baby, talking to him, singing to him, teaching him nonsense words. "You are going to grow up big and strong," Thomas would tell James, "and you are going to be smarter than your uncle was. You are going to make good choices and live a good life." Annie recovered well from the birth, and by October, she was back to most of her usual activities, though now with a baby strapped to her back or napping nearby. She had never been so tired in her life, but she had also never been so happy. Her life felt full in a way it never had before, full of love, full of purpose, full of hope. The ranch continued to prosper. Henry's reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle grew, and he found himself with more business than he could handle alone. In the spring of 1877, Thomas officially became a partner in the operation, invested his saved wages into buying more land adjacent to theirs, expanding their range and their possibilities. Little James grew from a baby into a toddler, walking at 10 months, getting into everything, fearless and curious. He loved the animals, would toddle out to the barn to see the horses, giggle with delight when the barn cat rubbed against his legs. Henry made him a small wooden horse that James dragged everywhere with him. On their second wedding anniversary, in August of 1877, Henry took Annie up to the high meadow where they had talked about having a family nearly 2 years before. They left James with Thomas, who was delighted to babysit his nephew. The aspens were beginning to turn again, touches of gold appearing among the green. They sat on the same rock, eating the same kind of lunch, bread, cheese, chicken, apples, and looked out over the valley that had become so completely home. 2 years, Annie said softly. "Can you believe it has only been 2 years?" "Sometimes it feels like forever," Henry said. "Like I cannot remember a time when you were not in my life. And sometimes it feels like it was just yesterday that I walked into that saloon and saw you standing there." "That was the best and worst night of my life," Annie reflected. "Best because it brought you to me. Worst because of what almost happened. But it did not happen. You are here safe with me. We have a son, a ranch, a future. Everything worked out exactly as it was supposed to. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not walked in that night? If you had been delayed or gone to a different saloon or just decided not to get involved?" Henry pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I try not to think about it because the thought makes me sick. But Annie, I believe some things are meant to be. I believe you and I were always supposed to find each other one way or another. Maybe not that exact way, but somehow, sometime. We were meant for each other." "I believe that too," Annie said, resting her head on his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead, listening to the whisper of the aspens and the distant sound of the creek. "I want another baby," Annie said suddenly. Henry pulled back to look at her. "Are you sure? James is only a year old." "You could wait, take time to recover fully." "I am recovered, and I am sure. I loved being pregnant, I love being a mother, and I want James to have siblings. I want the family we talked about. I want to fill this valley with life and laughter and love, remember." Henry smiled, that slow, warm smile that still made Annie's heart skip even after 2 years of marriage. "Then let us fill this valley. I am certainly willing to do my part." Annie laughed and pulled him down for a kiss. Their second child, a daughter they named Elizabeth Grace, was born in June of 1878. She was smaller than James had been, more delicate, with blonde hair that surprised them both. She was a quiet baby, content to observe the world with wide blue eyes, so different from James's boisterous energy. Thomas had met a woman by then, a widow named Catherine who ran the boarding house in town. She was 30, with a young son of her own, and she and Thomas had struck up a friendship that was slowly becoming something more. Annie was thrilled to see her brother finally finding happiness, finally leaving his painful past behind completely. In the fall of 1878, Thomas and Catherine were married in a small ceremony at the ranch. Annie stood as witness, with little James as an enthusiastic if chaotic ring bearer. Catherine and her son moved into the cabin Thomas had built on his portion of the land, and suddenly, the valley felt even more like a real community, a real home. The years passed in a blur of seasons and growth. James grew into a bright, adventurous boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to ride, to rope, to care for the animals. Elizabeth was quieter but equally determined, with a talent for plants and growing things. She would spend hours in Annie's garden, carefully tending each plant, delighting when things bloomed or produced fruit. In 1880, Annie gave birth to twin boys, Robert and Daniel, who were identical in appearance but opposite in temperament. Robert was serious and thoughtful, while Daniel was mischievous and always getting into trouble. They kept Annie running from morning to night, but she would not have traded them for anything. The ranch continued to expand and prosper. Henry and Thomas had become true partners, building something substantial and lasting. They employed several full-time hands, ran cattle and horses, and had a reputation throughout Colorado for integrity and quality. The cabin had been expanded twice more, now a proper house with 6 bedrooms, a large kitchen, a parlor, and a dining room that could seat 12. Annie had finally realized her dream of a dress shop in a way. She did not have a formal store, but she had become known throughout the county for her skill with a needle, and women came from miles around to commission dresses and other items from her. She worked from a room in the house that Henry had set up as a proper sewing room, with good light and space for her materials. It gave her satisfaction and purpose beyond her roles as wife and mother, a piece of herself that was just hers. On their 5th wedding anniversary in August of 1880, with 4 children asleep in their rooms and the house finally quiet, Henry and Annie sat on the porch, watching the stars come out over the mountains. "You remember what you said to me the night I proposed?" Annie asked. "Well, the night I proposed to you," Henry chuckled. "You said we would spend the rest of our lives getting to know each other better. You said that was what marriage was supposed to be. And were you right? Do you feel like you know me better now than you did then?" "I know you better, and I also know there is still so much more to learn," Henry said thoughtfully. "I know you sing to the children when you think no one is listening. I know you love thunderstorms but are afraid of spiders. I know you put honey in your coffee when you think I am not paying attention. I know you cry every time one of the children reaches a new milestone. I know you are the strongest, bravest, most loving person I have ever met. But I also know there are depths to you I have not yet discovered, thoughts and dreams and fears you have not yet shared, and I look forward to spending the next 50 years uncovering all of it." Annie felt tears prick her eyes. "How did I get so lucky? How did I find you?" "I think we found each other," Henry corrected gently, "and it was not luck, it was meant to be." "I am glad you paid double," Annie said with a watery laugh. "I am glad you asked for nothing in return." "Oh, I got everything in return," Henry said, pulling her close. I got this life. I got love and family and purpose. I got more than I ever dreamed was possible. That $2,000 was the best investment I ever made." "It was not an investment. You said yourself you expected nothing back. And I got everything back anyway. That is how love works, Annie. You give freely, expecting nothing, and somehow you end up receiving more than you could have imagined. They sat together on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the night sounds of the valley, the creek murmuring, the horses stamping in the barn, an owl hooting in the distance, the soft rustle of aspens in the breeze. This was home. This was family. This was the life they had built together from nothing but hope and courage and love. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges, but also joy and growth. James grew into a responsible young man who took after his father in temperament and skill. Elizabeth developed her mother's eye for beauty and detail, and by the time she was 12, she was helping Annie with the sewing business and showing real talent. The twins, Robert and Daniel, were inseparable despite their different personalities, and together they were a formidable team. In 1885, Annie gave birth to their youngest child, another daughter they named Sarah Catherine, after the midwife who had delivered James and after Thomas's wife. By then, Annie was 30 years old, and she and Henry decided this would be their last child. 5 children were plenty, and they wanted to focus their energy on raising the family they had rather than continuing to expand it. Sarah was a surprise in every way, the only one of their children to inherit Annie's gray eyes, with a personality that was both gentle and determined. From the start, she was the peacemaker among the siblings, the one who could settle disputes and bring harmony to chaos. Thomas and Catherine had 3 children of their own by then, and the valley was alive with young voices, with cousins playing together, with the next generation growing up in the security and love that Henry and Annie had worked so hard to create. St. Joseph, Missouri, seemed like a lifetime ago, like something that had happened to different people. Sometimes Annie would think back to that night in the saloon, to the fear and desperation she had felt, to the moment Henry had walked through those doors and changed everything. She would think about how close she had come to a completely different life, a dark and terrible life, and she would feel overwhelming gratitude for the path she had walked instead. In the summer of 1890, 15 years after that fateful night in St. Joseph, Annie and Henry took a trip together, just the two of them, leaving the children in Thomas and Catherine's care. They rode up to the high meadow, to the spot that had become special to them, where they had talked about their future all those years ago. The valley spread below them, lush and green and thriving. Their house, no longer a cabin but a real home, sat beside the creek, surrounded by gardens and outbuildings. Cattle grazed on the hills, horses ran in the pastures, and smoke rose from the chimney of Thomas's house in the distance. "We built this," Annie said, gesturing to the view. "You and I together, we built this." "We did," Henry agreed, "from nothing, from just hope and determination and love." "Do you have any regrets?" Annie asked. "Anything you would change if you could?" Henry thought about this seriously, as he thought about everything. "Not a single thing. Every choice, every hardship, every joy has led us here to this moment, to this life. How could I regret any of it? Not even paying $2,000 for a stranger's debt." Henry turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "Especially not that. Annie, you are not a stranger. You never were. From the moment I saw you, some part of me recognized you, knew you, understood that you were important, that you were meant to be mine, and I was meant to be yours. That $2,000 bought me a life worth living. It bought me you and everything that has come from that. It was the best bargain I ever made." Annie laughed, tears streaming down her face. "You are supposed to say it was not a bargain, that I am priceless, that I cannot be bought." "You are priceless," Henry said seriously. "You cannot be bought. But that night, You needed saving, and I needed a reason to keep living, to keep hoping, to believe that good things could still happen in this world. We saved each other, Annie. That is what love does. It saves us." They kissed there on the mountainside. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life and a family and a legacy from nothing but determination and love. The aspens whispered their approval, the Colorado sky spread endlessly overhead, and the valley they had made their home spread below them, full of life and possibility. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple, Henry and Annie rode back down to their house, to their children, to the life they had built together. James was teaching the younger children to rope, his patience with them a testament to the man he was becoming. Elizabeth was in the garden with Sarah, showing her younger sister which herbs could be used for cooking and which for medicine. The twins were working on some project in the barn, their voices rising in good-natured argument. This was family. This was home. This was love. That night, after the children were in bed, Henry and Annie sat on the porch as they had so many nights before, watching the stars come out. Henry had his arm around Annie and she leaned into him, comfortable and content. "I love you," Henry said softly. "More now than even on the day we married, more with each passing year, each passing day. You are my heart, Annie Keller. You are my everything." "And you are mine," Annie replied. "You saved my life, Henry. Not just that night in the saloon, but every day since. You showed me what love really means, what family really means, what home really means. You gave me everything I ever wanted and things I did not even know I could want. I love you with everything I am, everything I have, everything I will ever be." They sat in the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other completely, who had walked through fire and come out stronger, who had built something beautiful and lasting from the ashes of their separate pains and losses. The years continued to pass, bringing the joys and sorrows that are part of every life. Children grew and eventually left to start their own lives and families. James took over more and more of the ranch operations, proving himself every bit as capable as his father. Elizabeth married a doctor from Denver and moved to the city, but visited often, always bringing her own growing family to visit the grandparents, and the ranch she still considered home. The twins eventually started their own ranch in Montana, proving that the Keller knack for cattle and land ran true. Sarah, the youngest, was in no hurry to leave, content to help her mother with the sewing business and to care for the ever-expanding garden. Thomas and Catherine grew old alongside Henry and Annie, their friendship deepening with the years. They often sat together on summer evenings, the four of them, reminiscing about the early days, about how far they had all come, about the miracles that had brought them to this place. In 1900, 25 years after that night in St. Joseph, Henry and Annie celebrated their silver wedding anniversary with a gathering that filled their house and spilled out into the yard. Children and grandchildren came from near and far. The house rang with laughter and music and the sounds of family. At one point during the celebration, Henry pulled Annie aside, leading her away from the crowd to a quiet spot by the creek. The water burbled over rocks, just as it had for all the years they had lived here, constant and dependable. 25 years, Henry said, shaking his head in wonder. A quarter of a century. Annie, you have given me the most incredible 25 years of my life. We gave them to each other, Annie corrected. She was 45 now, her auburn hair threaded with silver, her face lined from years of sun and laughter. She had never been more beautiful to Henry than she was in that moment. You remember what you said on our first wedding anniversary. You asked if I felt like I knew you better than I did when we married. I remember. "I still do not know all of you," Henry said with a smile. "After 25 years, you still surprise me. You still make me laugh. You still make my heart race when you walk into a room. I still learn new things about you, and I hope I have another 25 years to keep discovering more." "I hope we have 50 more years," Annie said. "I hope we grow old and gray together. I hope we see our grandchildren have children of their own. I hope we sit on that porch when we are ancient and toothless and still hold hands and watch the stars come out." "That is the best future I can imagine," Henry said. He took her hands, the same gesture he had made so many times over the years, a gesture that always meant something important was coming. "Annie Gallagher Keller, you are the love of my life, the best decision I ever made, the greatest gift I have ever received. Thank you for saying yes to my crazy proposal. Thank you for taking a chance on a cowboy with nothing but hope and determination. Thank you for giving me a life worth living." "Thank you for paying double," Annie said, her eyes bright with tears and laughter. "Thank you for asking for nothing in return. Thank you for loving me, for choosing me, for building this life with me. I would do it all again, Henry. Every moment, every hardship, every joy. I would choose you 1,000 times over." They kissed there by the creek, surrounded by the sounds of their family celebrating nearby, in the valley they had made their own, under the vast Colorado sky that had witnessed their love story unfold. It was not a fairy tale ending, because it was not an ending at all. It was just another chapter in the continuing story of two people who had found each other against all odds and had built something beautiful together. As they walked back to the celebration, hand in hand, Annie looked up at the house they had built, at the children and grandchildren gathered there, at the life they had created, and she felt a profound sense of peace and gratitude. This was what it meant to be truly wealthy, not money, not possessions, but love and family and a life well lived. Henry and Annie did get their wish of growing old together. They lived to see their grandchildren marry and have children of their own. They lived to see the ranch continue to prosper under James's management. They lived to see the dawn of a new century, a new era, full of changes and possibilities. Through it all, they remained devoted to each other, their love deepening and maturing with the years. They still sat on the porch on summer evenings, still held hands, still watched the stars come out. They still told each other, "I love you," every single day, never taking for granted the miracle of having found each other. Henry lived to be 78 years old, passing peacefully in his sleep on a spring morning in 1926, with Annie beside him holding his hand. His last words were, "I love you, Annie. I will find you again." Annie lived another 5 years after Henry, cared for by her children and grandchildren, surrounded by love. She spent her final years sharing stories of the life she and Henry had built, of the love they had shared, of the miracles that had brought them together. She made sure every child and grandchild understood the importance of choosing love, of being brave enough to take chances, of building something meaningful with your life. On the day Annie died at the age of 76, surrounded by 3 generations of family in the house she and Henry had built, her last words were, "I am ready now, Henry. I am coming home." They were buried side by side on the hillside overlooking the valley, under the aspens that had witnessed so much of their love story. Their gravestone was simple but perfect, Henry and Annie Keller. Beloved husband and wife, parents and grandparents, they chose love, and love chose them back. The ranch continued through the generations, passed down through the family, always remembered as the place where two people who should never have met found each other and built something beautiful. The story of Henry paying double for Annie's freedom, asking nothing in return and finding love instead, became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as an example of what it means to do the right thing, to choose love, to build a life that matters. And in the end, that was their legacy, not the land or the cattle or the prosperity, but the love. The enduring, transformative, miraculous love that had started with a stranger walking into a saloon and deciding that no woman should be treated as property, that had grown into a partnership and a marriage and a family that spanned generations. They had built their life on a foundation of respect, kindness, courage, and love, and that foundation proved strong enough to last long after they were gone. The valley they had claimed and tamed and loved still stands today, though much has changed. But on summer evenings, when the aspens whisper in the breeze and the stars come out over the mountains, some say you can still feel the love that Henry and Annie poured into that land, that you can still sense the strength of what they built together. It was a love story for the ages, born in the Wild West, forged in hardship and hope, and lasting beyond death itself. It was proof that sometimes, when you give freely expecting nothing in return, you receive everything that truly matters.